They said it was all for science, progress, medicine, safety. But what they really meant was torture. Governments, scientists, even doctors, people we're supposed to trust, have performed experiments so disturbing they sound like fiction. But they're not. These aren't stories from horror movies, they're real, documented, hidden in declassified files and whispered by survivors. And once you hear them, you'll never look at a lab coat the same way again. I'm Disturbing Jack, and these are horrifying human experiments that actually happened. During World War II, deep in the frigid landscapes of Manchuria, Japan's Kwantung Army operated one of the most horrifying research facilities in human history. Officially named the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, it was known more simply and ominously as Unit 731. Led by microbiologist Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 had a mission cloaked in secrecy to develop biological weapons for the Empire of Japan. But the path they chose was darker than anything the world had seen. Thousands of civilians, including Chinese prisoners of war, Koreans, and even some Russians, were subjected to unimaginable experiments. The worst of them? The freezing experiments. Prisoners, referred to coldly as maruta, meaning logs, were taken outside into sub-zero temperatures, often stripped of clothing, and had their arms or legs submerged in ice water. The scientists would wait, sometimes for hours, as the flesh froze solid. They'd tap the limbs with metal rods to see if they made a hollow, icy sound. Then, without anesthesia, the researchers would begin their grisly work. They would attempt to rewarm the limbs with open flame or soak them in hot water baths, noting the different ways tissue would rot or blister. In some cases, flesh was surgically removed to observe how deep the frostbite had traveled. Entire limbs were amputated and sewn back on in reversed positions, hands placed backward or on the opposite arm to study nerve behavior. Many of these patients were kept alive for as long as possible, suffering in silent agony until infection or shock finally ended it. One female subject, who the staff referred to only as Specimen 22, survived 13 different procedures. Her legs had been frozen and amputated in stages, inch by inch. Researchers were fascinated by how long she could live without her lower limbs and how her body reacted to repeated shock. In her final days, she reportedly whispered in Chinese to one of the guards, "I dream of fire, but wake in ice." One of the most disturbing rumors comes from a former medical assistant who, decades later, confessed in a taped interview that during the final weeks of the war, panic set in as the Soviets advanced. Destruction orders were given to erase all evidence. The assistant recalled walking into a surgery room where a young man had been split open, literally dissected while conscious. "He looked me in the eyes," the assistant said, "and he didn't scream. He just mouthed the words, 'Help me.' I still see his face when I close my eyes." When Japan surrendered in 1945, you'd expect those responsible to be brought to justice. But here's the most horrifying part. They weren't. Instead, many of Unit 731's top doctors, including Shiro Ishii, were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research. America, now entering the Cold War with the Soviet Union, wanted access to the biological warfare data, even if it came from torture. These war criminals went on to lead comfortable lives. Some even took prestigious positions in hospitals and universities. The victims? Forgotten. In Japan, Unit 731 was a taboo topic for decades, omitted from textbooks, absent from trials, and denied by officials. Families of victims were silenced. Even today, the full extent of what happened in Pingfang, where the facility was located, is still not entirely known. Satellite images show overgrown ruins, but locals speak in whispers about the unmarked graves that litter the surrounding forest. One Japanese man, whose father served as a guard at the facility, claimed that his father would wake up screaming at night. "They weren't all monsters," he once said, "but they became monsters together. And perhaps that's what makes Unit 731 so disturbing. Not just the cruelty, but the calm, calculated clinical nature of it. These weren't mad scientists. These were educated doctors, fathers, sons, people who once swore an oath to heal. And yet, in the frozen silence of Manchuria, they chose instead to destroy. They chose to play God with ice. And now, decades later, though the world wants to forget, the ghosts of Unit 731 still whisper beneath the frost-covered soil. In the shadowy corridors of Soviet-era science, where ethics often bowed to ideology, there existed a relentless pursuit of understanding and controlling the human mind and body. One of the darkest chapters whispered about in classified circles and half-buried in declassified fragments is the real Soviet sleep deprivation experiments. Often overshadowed by the infamous Russian sleep experiment creepypasta, the truth is just as disturbing because it actually happened. It was the late 1940s. The world had barely emerged from the devastation of World War II, and the Cold War had begun to cast its long, icy shadow across the globe. In the Soviet Union, under Stalin's iron-fisted regime, human experimentation was not only tolerated, it was expected. Science served the state. Progress was paramount, no matter the cost. While there's no verifiable proof that prisoners were kept awake in sealed gas chambers for 30 days, there were real experiments conducted on sleep deprivation by both the Soviets and their Western counterparts. These studies, conducted in psychological and military research facilities, were designed to test human endurance, resilience, and the psychological consequences of extreme sleeplessness. One such test, documented in now declassified Soviet research logs from a psychiatric institute near Moscow, involved a group of 5 military volunteers. They were placed in a windowless, soundproofed room. The goal: remain awake as long as possible, without the aid of stimulants. By day 2, the men were irritable and anxious. Muscle tremors had begun. Some reported phantom noises, whispers, ticking, distant footsteps. Their speech slowed. Their thoughts became fractured. Subjects stared blankly into walls or obsessively scratched at their skin. By day 4, hallucinations emerged. One subject swore he saw his dead brother in the corner of the room. Another began to speak to someone named Lara, who did not exist. Then the paranoia set in. One subject accused another of being a spy. A fistfight broke out, requiring immediate intervention. But the most unsettling transformation came from a subject named Sergei P., a former combat pilot with a decorated war record. On day 5, he began speaking in full monologues, not in Russian but in German. The transcripts showed phrases like, "The black hands are here and she watches me from the ceiling." Sergei hadn't spoken German since childhood. By day 7, Sergei was catatonic. He sat motionless, his eyes wide open, his lips moving without sound. His heart rate dropped dangerously low, but his brain activity remained hyperactive, similar to someone in the middle of a waking nightmare. At this point, the experiment was aborted. However, not all participants survived. One subject had chewed through part of his own lip during a delusional episode. Another attempted to gouge out his own eyes, screaming about shadows in the mirror. A third collapsed from cardiac arrhythmia. The official cause was stress-induced heart failure. That man was only 27 years old. Sergei, once lucid and proud, would spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. Nurses reported that he would sometimes stand motionless in the hallway at night, whispering to the woman with no skin. What the Soviets discovered was never published in mainstream medical journals, but it spread in classified memos. Prolonged sleep deprivation doesn't just exhaust the body, it shatters the mind. Auditory hallucinations, cognitive breakdowns, and in some cases, irreversible psychosis can begin after just 4 to 5 days without sleep. Modern science has since confirmed many of these symptoms. In 1965, American high school student Randy Gardner stayed awake for 11 days under supervision. He experienced paranoia, slurred speech, and hallucinations, but he recovered. The difference? Gardner was monitored safely. The Soviets, however, pushed further with fewer rules and much darker motives. A declassified CIA document from 1953 even references Soviet interest in neurological sleep resistance as a method of interrogation and control. In other words, they weren't just researching sleep. They were trying to weaponize its absence. And here's where fact bleeds into the unknown. A single page from a recovered Soviet file, now housed in the Museum of Medical History in St. Petersburg. Petersburg contains an unverified observation from one of the overseeing doctors. They do not sleep. Even sedated, their eyes move violently. One mumbled that he sees through time, that the void knows his name. This note has never been confirmed by any surviving scientists. It could be a fabrication or a joke or something more. According to anecdotal accounts after the incident, the chamber was sealed shut and never used again. A maintenance worker later claimed that when he entered the room weeks later, he could still smell something sweet and metallic in the air. When asked what he meant, he simply said, like blood and burnt dreams. Whatever the truth, the real Soviet sleep deprivation experiments were brutal, horrifying, and very, very real. And while the infamous internet legend may have taken creative liberties, the human cost of tampering with sleep remains undeniable and terrifying. In the deep classified catacombs of Cold War America, far from the public eye and outside the bounds of morality, a dark chapter of human experimentation was quietly unfolding. Its name was MK Ultra, and for over 2 decades it was one of the most disturbing and secretive programs ever conducted by the United States government. At first glance, MK Ultra might sound like science fiction, the CIA attempting to control the human mind. But this was no fantasy. It was very real, and its victims were very real too. In the early 1950s, the CIA was obsessed with one thing: staying ahead of the Soviets. The Cold War was raging, paranoia was at its peak, and reports suggested that the USSR was experimenting with drugs, hypnosis, and psychological conditioning to control minds. The US had to respond, and they did with terrifying ambition. Project MK Ultra officially began in 1953, authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles. The goal? Develop methods of mind control for interrogation, psychological warfare, and, as documents later revealed, behavioral modification. But this wasn't about voluntary testing. Subjects were often unwitting participants. They included prison inmates, mental patients, soldiers, and ordinary civilians. Some were given LSD without their knowledge. Others were subjected to sleep deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy, and even isolation in sensory deprivation tanks for days at a time. The idea was to break the mind, then rebuild it. One of the most infamous cases tied to MK Ultra was that of Dr. Frank Olson, a US Army scientist who worked with biological weapons. In 1953, Olson was covertly dosed with LSD during a retreat run by the CIA. 9 days later, he fell, or jumped, from a 13th-floor hotel window in New York. The official report said suicide, but years later, his family uncovered documents suggesting foul play, that Olson had begun to question the ethics of the experiments and may have been silenced. His son later had the body exhumed. The autopsy showed no signs of typical fall injuries, but evidence of blunt force trauma to the head. As one forensic pathologist said, he may have already been dead before he hit the ground. In the late 1950s and early 60s, a psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron ran MK-Ultra experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. His methods? Barbaric. Patients came in for mild conditions like anxiety or postpartum depression. They were then drugged with massive doses of LSD, put into chemically induced comas for weeks and subjected to repetitive audio loops, sometimes up to 20 hours a day, attempting to rewire their personalities. One woman, Linda McDonald, was reduced to a childlike state. She couldn't remember her husband or children. She had to relearn how to walk, talk, and use the bathroom. Her file simply labeled her as successful de-patterning. She had come in for insomnia. In 1973, just as the Watergate scandal broke, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most of the MK-Ultra documents destroyed. Tens of thousands of pages vanished overnight. But in 1977, a trove of surviving documents was discovered in a financial archive, and the horror resurfaced. From those files, we learned about over 150 sub-projects, including experiments on children in psychiatric hospitals, attempts to develop truth serums using mescaline and psilocybin, use of prostitutes in CIA-run safe houses to secretly drug and observe clients, the testing of LSD on American soldiers, leading some to long-term psychosis. Even more disturbing were the redacted entries, entire pages blacked out, only fragments remaining. Subject exhibits dissociative behavior, claims to see multiple versions of reality. Test number 32, self-harm resulted. Subject begged to be reinserted into original timeline. These lines are real, but what they mean is still a mystery. While the official narrative of MK-Ultra ends in the 70s, whispers of its legacy continue. One former U.S. Air Force member under the pseudonym MK Ghost claimed in an anonymous interview that his memory returned slowly over years through dreams and flashes. He described being kept in a bright white room as a teenager, with no clocks, no windows, and constant high-pitched humming. Once, he says, a man in a lab coat stared into his eyes and asked, "If you're the real you, where did the other you go?" Another account, still unverified, came from a nurse who worked at a military hospital in the late 60s. She told of a wing where patients were labeled only by number. She recalled one boy, maybe 15, who would scream for hours saying, "The thoughts are not mine, they're burning me." Were these isolated incidents, or remnants of a much wider, still active experiment? No one truly knows. In 1995, President Clinton issued a public apology for past government experiments on unwilling citizens. He admitted that many were harmed without their consent, but MK-Ultra was barely mentioned. To this day, no one has been held fully accountable. The victims, many of whom never even knew what had been done to them, received little or no compensation. Some died in psychiatric hospitals. Some took their own lives, and others simply disappeared. And the most terrifying part? We still don't know what we don't know. If this video made your skin crawl, like, subscribe, and let the algorithm know you're not afraid of the truth. There are more stories like these, buried, forgotten, twisting in the shadows where science meets nightmare. And I promise, what's coming next is more terrifying. This is Disturbing Jack, and you've just witnessed what happens when humanity plays God and loses control. Stay aware, stay disturbed, and never stop questioning the experiments that are still happening in silence.